Welcome back to another episode of the Talent Lab. I'm Brad McMillan, joined as always by my colleague Marina Hart. Today, we're sitting down with a guest whose career has taken him from global pharma leadership to startup founder, from respiratory disease research to vaccines, from Japan to San Diego, and from discovery science all the way through clinical development and company exits. Dr. Kevin Bacon has spent decades building programs, leading organizations, raising capital, and helping move therapies forward. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. It's great to see you again. Nice to see you, Marina. Nice to see you, Bradley. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And before we get started, we need to obviously acknowledge the obvious. If you hear a suspicious number of Kevin Bacon references throughout the episode, that's entirely Brad's fault.
I make absolutely no promises. I was told there'd be consequences if I crossed 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but I think we're already there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
it's fine actually. I have gotten used to the fact that it absolutely makes no difference anymore. I don't get any benefit from it, so I have to just carry on.
That's true. Well, Kevin, before we get into your career and some of the other topics that we'll cover today, we always like to start with just a simple introduction. For listeners who may not know who you are, as opposed to the other Kevin Bacon, tell us a little bit about who you are, what brought you here, how you think about the work that you do today. One of the things that I kind of want you to emphasize, because you mentioned that in our previous conversation, that you are a science executive rather than like a biotech or pharma executive. And that distinction just caught my ear. And I'm like, I want Kevin to explain that and zero in as to what that actually means.
Yes, thank you. So that's my problem. Now I'm going to have to find an answer for that. That makes sense. So my name is Kevin Bacon. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm actually a pharmacologist by training and have been in the industry for over 35 years, essentially always involved in drug discovery and clinical development. Why I call myself a science executive is because I firmly believe that, obviously I'm in biotech and pharma, and therefore I am a biotech and pharma executive, but I firmly believe that there is a lot of need to make sure that the science that we do behind what we're eventually developing is so critical. And so I spend a lot of time, and I have spent a lot of time over the course of my career in making sure that the diligence applied in the development of early preclinical sciences and beyond has always maintained the highest standard, or at least tried to always maintain the highest standard. So that's really why I call myself a science executive.
Fantastic.
Understood.
So let's go back to the beginning. So, how did you first get into pharmacology and drug development? Was there a specific moment where you knew this was the path for you, or did you find yourself drifting towards the science one step at a time until you realize you've landed exactly where you belonged? So, I guess, in other words, was this a carefully mapped out career or slightly a more footloose journey?
I got it. So absolutely not. It was never mapped out in that respect. I think what I can say, I mean, it's a long time ago. Um, I was always drawn to the sciences, always drawn to biology, human biology, and to chemistry. And on the other hand, didn't really want to exclusively focus on one or other. And I wanted to find that intersection, that relevant applicability, if you like, of the two together. And I don't obviously recall the sort of the moment, if you like, where it changed. But as I started my qualifications and exams, etc., I realized that this was definitely something that was evolving along the trajectory that I liked and was really interested in, and held an enormous breadth and scope going forward. So uh, you did mention, that moment where I realized that that's what it was. Maybe I haven't realized yet what it is, because I'm still looking and I'm still driving and I'm still trying to produce, the best possible solutions, especially when it comes to patient care.
Yeah. I mean, we all love a good origin story, but sometimes it is the continuation or the process, or what's that expression, the journey itself.
Yes.
That makes more sense. In your particular case, when we look back at your career, there is a common denominator between everything that you've done so far, and that's building. Like you repeatedly chose to build something. So, what keeps pulling you back to the actual building? And what's something people really underestimate about the reality of building something from like an early stage asset? I think that's something that would be interesting to hear for our audience.
Yeah, that's a huge sort of topic, and it's a very broad one. Why do I keep building? Is because personally, in my opinion, I see so many opportunities of things that have not been exploited
Mm.
and can be exploited. And obviously, as one focuses in the development trajectory, you have to make sure you're sort of covering all the right bases and focusing on the right tasks at hand. But every step of the way, and again, in my experience and in my opinion, I've found avenues where that answer doesn't fit with the paradigm, or that is really something that has never been looked at, but is obviously important to the end product or to the outcome. Maybe we can go, slightly off on a tangent, but that inevitably has led to being able to build certain things. I can give you an example. I've been heavily focused in respiratory for most of my career, but one of the avenues that I've taken with one of the companies I've started actually had an enormous uh, flashing bulb, if you like, of the CNS and the same target area from the respiratory jumping over to the CNS avenue was something that was never really looked at. And it's something I'm exploring now. So continuing to try and build. Of course, it's early, which means that I have to go through the process. I have to go through understanding whether or not, through the diligence of the approach, whether or not there really is going to be an avenue there. But it's something that, clearly requires building. And so you've
Yeah.
got to start and you've got to carry it through. And that certain junctures, there will be a moment where it says, nope, that's not going to work. So you stop, and you have to stop, and you have to be disciplined enough to stop. But the fact that it's opened up in the first place means that it's just one of those many, many avenues where you see things that require investigation where other people are not doing it.
It seems that, one theme that seems to come up through your career is connecting pieces that other people tend to treat separately. So, in drug development, that often means breaking down the walls between discovery, clinical, and commercial teams. And just curious, why do you think that matters so much?
Can you repeat? Sorry, why does it matter that we're breaking it down, or why does it matter that I'm
Yeah.
joining?
So just we're talking about connecting the pieces that other people treat separately, and sometimes that does mean breaking down those silos between discovery and clinical and commercial teams that you would see in a much larger organization. So why do you think that, or do you think it matters, or why do you think it matters to break down those walls between the different phases of discovery, clinical, and commercial teams?
I don't think you should break them down at all. I think one of the lessons I've learned throughout my career is that the best programs and the best projects and the most successful ones are the ones where you are intrinsically linked right at the outset, right the way through to the marketing organization, if you've got one, obviously, in the organization where you work. I really do believe that there are still many, many examples where people simply treat preclinical drug discovery in absence of, why. Why are they doing that? Why are they looking at that target? Is that target really relevant? At the end of the day, is there going to be a viable entity that can help patients? That's obviously the first customer. Second customer, is there going to be a viable entity that an organization can market and sell, et cetera, et cetera? You've got to be talking. You've got to be having those conversations right at the outset, and we see it all the time, especially in discovery. And I've been involved as well with some of the NIH grant funding cycles, and I look at some of the applications there, and it's just a complete oblivious sort of vision, lack of vision, I should say, to why are they doing this? Why are you asking for grant money to do something like this? Or
Yeah.
in a smaller organization, why are you targeting this particular area when you know very well, based on the history, based on examples that have come before you, that is not going to be a valid path?
And just to kind of build on that bigger why, right? One of the things that struck me during our prior conversations is exactly what you just mentioned, your perspective on who the customer actually is in drug development, right? So most people who enter the biotech or life sciences world do it because they want to add to the positive outcomes for patients, right? Like that's the mission that draws you in. That's where the heart is. That's the biggest why. But
Yes.
then you pointed out before that, particularly in some of the smaller companies, there's often like other stakeholders, other influencers who pave that path forward. It's not just about the patient in the end. So investors, pharma, big pharma partners, licensing opportunities, and all of those aspects. So from your perspective and your experience, how do you kind of just like balance that, the decisions that are being created with other things in mind than just the patient and the patient outcomes?
Yes, I mean it's a sad reality, and I was reading an article about this yesterday. It's a sad reality that the dollar sign or the pound sign or the franc or the euro or whatever is what is driving us. Obviously, our industry is predicated on the basis of human, uh, you know, trials and results to benefit patients. But at the end of the day, if there isn't the money available to help provide that, or rather fuel that path, that's where we become unstuck. And unfortunately, and you see this with rare diseases right now, for example, there's a complete down cycle in terms of investment to rare diseases simply because it's not producing the returns quickly enough and big enough, I should say, bigly, for a lot of these investment groups and for the pharma. And unfortunately, we do have to, we have to look at the money. Where is it coming from? How are we going to do this?
Mhm.
And you've got to be able to try your best to balance that. And of course, it doesn't always work. But that's the way we have to operate. We have to do it in tandem.
Yeah.
Sure. And, that actually connects to something I've seen throughout biotech. So when you're balancing patients, investors, patents, and the realities of building a company, there's a constant pressure to focus on that next milestone, on that next IND, that next round of financing, that next data readout, the next press release. But eventually the science has to hold up and the strategy has to hold up and the execution has to hold up. So at some point, every team runs into what I'd like to call the a few good men moment. The point where kind of the hard questions can no longer be avoided.
Right.
So with that in mind, how do you keep an organization as a leader? How do you keep an organization focused on building something that can actually survive clinical development rather than, survive the next board meeting?
It's a really good question, and unfortunately, and I now I put my sort of C-suite hat on, and this is unfortunately the product of you know some past bad examples where unfortunately those wonderful days where somebody threw a bunch of money at you and let you run wild and do what you had to do
Yeah.
are simply not there because we are dealing with other people's money and we have to justify what it is we want to spend it on. And therefore, you've got to be able to show and you've got to be able to have that rational design laid out where you can say, okay, this is what we have to do. And you have to sort of break it down from big picture into individual steps just to placate the financiers because they don't really care necessarily about big picture. I mean, let's take development of a drug where we know that at the end of the day, we're going to go from this preclinical target that we've identified to having a drug that's in clinical, phase one, first in human, and moving it forward, et cetera, et cetera. They don't really care about all the bits and pieces that have to go on in between big picture. What they do want to know is that you're not wasting the money. And so it's not a conversation. It's not a deep conversation. It's simply, let's make it clear to them where that money is going and what it requires in terms of cost outlay to do it. And you just have to do it these days. There's nothing you can get around in that respect. Now, the smarter organizations, or those who have the flexibility, will be able to gather that money and start doing what they've said they're going to do, but at the same time, do a few extra things. There's always a possibility to do a few extra things and to get a little bit more information out of that initial infusion of cash and move that forward. And that's where potentially the breakthroughs come, because then you have the flexibility of maybe changing your let's say your gene target into one that's a different mutation within, let's say, an oncology setting. Or if you've already got a small molecule, you can actually go for an optimized better candidate or an antibody. You can do a little bit more engineering to get the optimal binder, etc. So you've got to be able to lay out the clear path of what's required, but then you've got to be able to manage, that flexibility to get a little bit of extra done.
Yeah, you got to be able to pivot, right? And I think this is a perfect foray to my next question, because it doesn't sound like it's a single strategy or a single great plan. It's almost like a combination of different choices, whether it's a financing event, a clinical milestone, or execution over a long period of time, and then ability to pivot into what is needed. So when you look at a program that ultimately succeeds versus the one that fails, it's obviously not just one thing, but what is, or what are some of the differentiators? Is it strategy? Is it people? Is it the plan? Is it something else entirely? If you could pinpoint that, what does that look like to you?
I think if you've already designed your program, or you already have your program in mind and you're marching along, let's say, to clinical development, there are numerous potential stumbling blocks, if you simply don't follow what has to be done. I mean, it's very clear in today's sort of pharmaceutical development paradigm. There are things that have to be done. You can't get around them. And if you want to get through the FDA review and the regulatory committees, et cetera, you have to make sure those things are done. That's where oftentimes a lot of things fall down. People trying to cut corners, not do what they have to do. But I think that, there really has always got to be oversight to not only managing those particular pathways, but making sure that everything flows seamlessly from point A to point B to point C. Sometimes people want to do one thing and then they wait, see what happens, and then let's start thinking now about getting our regulatory team in place or getting our clinical team in place. No, you've got to start doing all of that stuff right at the outset to understand, should there be a problem, can you backpedal? Can you not have spent all the money on everything else when you've got to go back to the drawing board, et cetera, et cetera? So you've got to have this constant view on all the processes that are necessary if you've already established your program. Now, of course, if you're doing discovery, that's a different story.
Sure. I think that's interesting because some of those challenges seem to be showing up across the industry right now. So on the surface, the industry has always had plenty of visible movement, new platforms, new financing rounds, new clinical updates and headlines. But there's a lot of issues beneath that, a lot of tremors, if you will. So scientific risk, financing pressure, operational strain, and a tougher path from promising data to real value. Just where they're seeing the data, good data is not enough. It now needs to be great data. It needs to be collected and connected. So from where you sit, what are the biggest pressures that you see shaping biotech today? And which risks do you think leaders need to be paying attention to before they break the surface?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. I think that there's no shortage of sort of platform discussion. If you look at platforms like LinkedIn or some of the other, Fierce Biotech, all these sort of different avenues where people actually voice their opinions and put op-eds out, etc. There's no shortage of things that are being voiced as, where the issues lie. I think a lot of us, we're obviously trying to reset, if you like, after the financial pressures of 23, 24, which was essentially, if I have to be really brutal, I honestly still believe that was brought on by people simply not doing their job properly. There was a lot of investment thrown into a huge number of early stage companies, lots of IPOs being done on things that were never really sort of diligently investigated or be done properly. And it was just like, have some money, have some money. And of course, what happened then, the whole thing collapses and there's a ton of
Yeah, the
companies
bubble.
going out of business, all this sort of stuff. So I think a lot of that was just really, bad behavior, if you like. But the issue that remains for all of us is, as I've mentioned before, one of financing and being able to secure funds to do the things that you need to do now is incredibly difficult because people are trying to figure out, okay, well, that happened back in those years. Now, what can we do differently that it doesn't happen again? And so a lot of it's going to much later stage de-risk programs, and you see this written all the time, is going very, very heavily, in my opinion, into the oncology space, where honestly speaking, when you even speak with people in the oncology space, they're talking about incremental improvements for treatments for patients. And a lot of the other disease areas are being ignored to a certain degree. There's a lot of Me Too stuff going on. Obviously, some of the bigger markets have the capacity to absorb that. The GLP-1s, for example,
Mhm.
the biologics and respiratory is another one, for example. But I just think that there are enormous numbers of really good assets out there that are not seeing the light of day simply because they don't fit that sort of paradigm that everyone is looking at and following along the same trajectory. And it's very, very unfortunate because a lot of companies are going out of business when they don't really need to. Unfortunately, just for a few dollars, they could get on. I think that's the biggest
Mhm.
pressure.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
think we're also seeing a lot of companies becoming leaner, right? Like they're reducing discovery headcount. They're relying more heavily on AI or some other platforms, outsourcing a larger bulk of the work to CROs or not, bring some stuff in house. It's always cyclical in this industry, right? So, from your perspective, is it what's really happening? Are we just going through growing pains? Are we readjusting? Are we actually on the cusp of a significant shift of how biotech companies actually build themselves and their teams? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I do think we are, and I think you mentioned obviously AI, is driving a lot of that, and it's also
Mhm.
driving a lot of people's perceptions and how they act, because they don't necessarily understand everything. We never do, right? We all don't understand everything there is to understand. Things evolve and things do build, but let's take the example with a biotech that starts off as a platform. That's all good and well because they're generating, you know, information, they're generating assets, they're generating novelty through their platform in terms of development. But those that are working on a particular asset or a particular target, they are now, having to focus very, very heavily on the money. Where is it coming from and what's it going to
Mhm.
be given for? And then, where's the competition coming from that AI platform against their molecule or against their antibody, et cetera, et cetera. And really sort of having to be very, very diligent about how they go forward because it could be a really quick fix in terms of, i.e., they could be kicked out of business by somebody just getting picked, they're faster than them and being more
Yeah.
successful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult time for the next few years as we try and understand how best to build a company that's going to last and actually move forward quickly enough to producing an asset that can have an exit either through the FDA approval process or through an immediate customer, which is big pharma franchise.
Right, right. And so sometimes building a biotech must feel a little bit like Apollo 13. So the mission is, incredibly important. Resources are limited and every decision matters. So when you're evaluating an early stage company today, whether as a operator, advisor, investor, or board member, from where you sit, what are the signals that gives you confidence in in an organization, in an asset, in a process? So what kind of separates companies that are likely to find a path forward, from those that aren't, that you would be using as evaluation criteria?
Very early impact at the level of translation to the human disease or the human condition that is being targeted. Again, coming back down to sort of designing and, choosing which targets to go forward. th- There's an enormous need to make sure that there's validation with the right view going forward, i.e., is this really a target that is somehow switched on or off in the human disease condition or the human physiological condition where it's going to be impacted once you start hitting it with a some sort of modulator. We see that with some of the big pharma. Of course, they have these massive facilities where they're able to access human tissue databases, or even their own internal infrastructure has allowed them to be able to access human tissue and data early on, and they really choose very, very effectively which targets can actually go forward in terms of getting the resources internally in-house, or no, those that are not going to get resources in-house. Now, of course, they can't do everything. So yes, they're still looking externally for others who may have a different setup. But at the end of the day, just picking a target because it sounds great or you've just cloned it and it's novel, blah, 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 not going to happen. Got to have real reason for doing that. And that's where the money's going to come as well, because the investors are going to say, okay, yeah, I see this market down the line. I see what, the potential is. And this is what I want to invest my money in.
Yeah.
Sure.
Lots of human conversations. We may be using AI tools to understand some of that, but the analysis, some of the conversations that need to be happening with the investors are still happening at the talent level, which clearly is what Brett and I are very passionate about. So I kind of wanted to pivot into that. Um, One of the things that we're seeing, especially when companies struggle, is something that you brought up in our prior conversations. We see that the modern biotech job descriptions we aided with, developed with the help of the AI. Sometimes they're becoming completely ridiculous. It's like companies are looking for this purple squirrel riding a unicorn, something like that, right? And so when the candidates are expected to have every technical skill, every leadership capability, every therapeutic area of expertise, um, like somehow also need to be available on Monday, how do you juggle that as a hiring manager, right? Like Brett and I know what our advice is. Call us, we'll help you, right? But but from your perspective, why are companies chasing these impossibly specific profiles when the reality of it is they will not be able to find them?
It's a really good question, and I totally agree with you. I think that it's beyond stupid. Those people simply do not exist. I
Mm,
don't know. I mean, in the X years that I've been involved in this industry and continuing to meet and talk to people, I have never come across anyone who fulfills even a fraction of some of these bulleted requirements when these job
mm,
adverts appear. I've never seen it. And you can't expect that. Okay. You can't expect someone to have the depth of experience and knowledge across 6 different therapeutic areas, or across even in oncology, across 6 different oncological settings, right? They've never had that exposure. No matter what they say, they will not have had it to the depth that is required to answer that AI generated prompt, because I don't even think that the employers really want that. I don't think they know what they want, to be honest. So I, I, I simply don't know what the answer is to why they're doing it.
Mhm.
How they're, going forward, I think they're going to come to the realization pretty quickly that they have to do something different. They have to break it down to potentially someone who has the ability to, get into a conversation and offer intellect and intelligent responses while working with the team of experts that has been built or wants to be built within that organization. Every successful program that I've ever been involved with has had a team. And,
Mhm.
you see people sometimes with their resumes where, yeah, they've been responsible for drug approval, blah, blah, blah. No one's ever responsible for drug approval on their
On
own.
their own.
It never
Yeah.
happens, right? When
Mhm.
you look at the list of people and functions that go into a drug approval, you know that there's got to be a team, right? Now, that team can be quite small to start with, but as you go through development and as you go through late clinical stage development, that team is going to expand to
Yeah.
tens, if not more. And so I think it has to come down to these recruiters, or not recruiters, the companies that want this job position, being realistic about what it is they're actually looking for. If they want someone specific and with a defined functionality, then ask for that. But don't ask for 16 different degrees and 500 different years of clinical development. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think every recruiter listening just nodded their head. And just the continual, bolt on of these, of these wish lists and trying to manifest that into a person. And it would be nice if we had this and this and this. And, then there's somebody on the other end of the line listening to that and actually thinking that it's out there. There's just not the rationale as to why would all of this experience exist in someone?
Right.
From looking at at that perspective. Because as you're, continuing, to build out those side pieces, that search takes on kind of a hollow man quality.
Goodness. Yeah.
How
And
much
one
So
of
time did you spend doing this, Brad?
oh
You're even
boy.
catching me out on several occasions, but
Yeah. Well,
um But, I mean, everyone has a picture of the ideal candidate in their head, but when you ask whether that person actually exists, things just get a little less visible, that conversation gets a little less clear.
yes,
yeah. We can probably
absolutely.
talk about that for hours on end. But something you mentioned in our previous conversations, and maybe that's just something that's a little bit closer to my heart, since I am originally from Ukraine, but grew up and built my professional career here. You have spent years leading cross-functional teams all over the globe, right? U.S., Europe, Japan. Is there something that you've learned about leadership, but specifically within like the global scale or in one part of the world that is informing how you lead in another? Any lessons from that, from the global experience?
There have been minor things that are very specific depending on the organization, but I think
Hmm.
the overarching view that I have is that people are, and again, this sounds terribly cliched because you hear it all the time, but people are the cornerstone of this industry still. And without a successful team that is, as smoothly as possible functioning, you're not going to really get anywhere very effectively. And so, what I've learned over time is really to invest a lot of my effort in making sure that those teams are a fully understanding of what the objectives are and the goals are, but also being able to work with each other.
Yeah.
I have spent, unfortunately and fortunately, some too many months and weeks battling with groups of individuals who really think that their little function is so important that they need greater resources than, the other guy or whatever. But they don't realize that big picture wise, it doesn't matter. It's all going to come out in the wash, so to speak, at the end. They've got to be able to work together and apportion what's going on effectively within the budget constraints that one has, but also within the objectives of the organization. So I think personnel management, this long rambling way of saying personnel management, is such a critical element to any organization, big or small. And of course, the bigger it is, the more challenging to a certain degree. But then, as Brad mentioned earlier on, if you start subdividing functionalities into silos, etc., then that's not
Yeah.
necessarily as much of a problem as a smaller organization. But you see it all the time. There's always this need to really make sure people are, you know, visible, functional, and doing well together.
Yeah.
It can work in very, very positive ways. And that's something I've spent, almost the entirety of my career in management focusing on.
I love that you landed on people as the answer to that. And because honestly, we're seeing a lot of that juxtaposition of people and AI, which this was a little trap that I set up for you because now I'm going to ask you about what we always talk about,
Sure.
AI. And
Yeah.
because it's become such a significant portion of our conversation. Almost every leader we've spoken with at one point or another has some ideas how AI is going to be used to increase expertise or data or analysis. Um, and it feels like we all need to collect opinions. So, putting you on the spot, where do you, Kevin Bacon, on the record, think that AI is going to make the biggest difference in biotech? And then as the juxtaposition that, where do you feel that people will still remain the main decision makers moving us forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that first and foremost, we need to embrace this. We need to understand that this is not something that's a fad. It's not going away. It's going to be
Mhm.
integral to just about everything. I mean, it's integral to everything we do anyway in life, as opposed to our industry. But and it'll evolve. And I think the evolution is something that no one can predict. I'm not certainly not going to stand on record here and predict where AI is going to end
Okay.
up in the industry. But
We
what I'm
didn't
going to
get him.
no, what I'm going to do is to say, look, in terms of embracing it, I think that it is absolutely fabulous what it's done so far, especially in terms of the early discovery elements, but also in terms of other aspects, more sort of routine aspects such as, clinical protocol writing, all this sort of stuff. But at no step do I view it as exclusive. Let's take an example where, one of the things we see AI doing incredibly well right now is optimizing antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, and the potential for ADC development, all this sort of stuff. Obviously that's determined by information going in as to what you get out. But at the end of the day, there are two elements there, is that there's still a need for the testing in the real world setting of that, because the AI is not going to be able to tell you what happens in a even an animal model, or in a human clinical trial, and you will
Mhm.
need people to be involved at that, along each step of the way. But one of the sort of issues about this that one has to be very, very careful about going forward is that it's actually going to make things a little bit more expensive, in my opinion, because great that you have all this added novelty and these new things and the potential for more, but
Yeah.
then where are the resources coming from to actually develop the more, right? I mean, we can't put everything into a clinical trial. We can't put everything into development. We have to somehow be able to filter and to stratify, the optimal candidates, etc. And I think people are still
Mm.
going to be necessary to do that. And I don't think we're there yet, nor will we be there for a few years, with the sort of latter stages for clinical development, protocol writing, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's all good and well. It saves time and it helps. But again, you know, our industry is predicated on the results of human experimentation, but not all humans are the same. So whatever's going in has to be curated, and it has to be treated with the sort of respect, if you like, of the fact that it's pretty much siloed in itself, and it's a box, and you've got to be able to review that and to understand it effectively. But
Hmm.
let's look at clinical trials, right? Again, with all these opportunities for developing novel clinical trials, we all know that getting a cohort together for a clinical trial is a major undertaking.
Yeah.
It's never easy, right? Screening, all this sort of stuff, getting your trial population is not something that AI is going to be able to take care of right now. Um, and as we go forward, those become even more limited. Especially if you again, using my own experiences in respiratory, if you take, you want to do a new asthma clinical trial, but you can't have patients who are already on steroids or beta agonists or anything like that, or somehow modulating what your response is. You need to have naive patients, or you need to have patients who have a certain stratification in terms of what treatments they're already on. Eventually those are going to run out. So you can't have all these people going into trials, and then you have to go to different uh, regions, different global
Yeah.
populations. But then those global populations are very different to potentially the European or the North American populations that you're used to working with. And I've seen it in respiratory, where drug candidates did not work on a certain population in the APAC region because of genetic point mutations in certain genes, etc. And you had to come back to the West, and a drug could not be developed. So, there are so many avenues, I think, where, yes, we must embrace the AI element, and we've got to watch it very carefully. But today, you've still got to have people who have got to curate a lot of that information.
Well, it's interesting. Saw somebody's post out there about how it wasn't capturing their voice, or wasn't coming out. AI, like, if you're not creating your own persona, creating your own voice, creating your own data set, AI assumes you're a 27-year-old white male. Assumes those
Yes, I argue with it
responses. And if
all the
that's what we're
time.
doing in a large language module, with just what was able to be put into it and the volume, I think we really have to worry about, what goes into what goes into the drug discovery process.
Yeah.
And I think also, AI finds its way in about every conversation these days, and it's getting a good at a lot of things. I
Yeah.
haven't seen it bring out order to a animal house of a hiring process. All is well. All is
Nice.
well.
I'm looking for the white horse now. Just to, it's really
But I mean,
interesting,
just
and I think one
trying
of the
to teach and show different leaders what hiring looks like. How that's actually created, and it just seems to be still where Marina and I earn our keep. But I mean, but seriously, if a hiring manager came to you and said, "I can't find the right person," what's the first thing that you'd tell them? Besides, of course, call Brad and Marina at RPM Research.
of course.
But
Again, I would have to take a look at what the remit is, and what they're asking for, and then you'd have to sort of break it down from there. I mean, you as I said before, you can't have everything.
Mhm.
You can't wish. I mean, you can wish for everything, but you can't have it because it just doesn't exist. And you've got to be able to tailor your candidate to you know a function that you define as going to be the most critical for what you're immediately hiring for. And
The pain point. Mhm.
yeah, and I think that's really where we're still. That used to be done 30 years ago. That now they're just trying to do it differently with different tools, and the outcome is going to be the same. You've got to have people who can fulfill a certain element or desire of that functionality that you're really looking for, not just this unicorn that you think you should have in your institution or your organization because it's going to be better for the competition. I just don't think it's realistic.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because in conversations with, especially new clients or new hiring managers, when I, talk with them about the role and what they shared, it takes a minute for them to really be able to formulate what are the first three projects that, or what is the first project that this person is going to handle, what is the secondary and tertiary projects, and what does that really look like. And I feel like it should come across a little bit more natural, but
Mhm.
that's more of a discovery process that we have with more and more people, surrounding complex roles. As far as just, we're not looking for just a body in a box here. How is this going to move forward, and how have we identified that business problem? And once we have that conversation, none of this was on the job description. None of
Right.
Yeah.
this was on the
Right.
website.
Yeah.
Nobody would have known about this, and there's just a disconnect between what people feel they can say and what people need to say. And
Mhm.
I just haven't fully wrapped my head around why we can't just be open and honest, and real about what we're looking for. Does that make us look weak in the eyes of our competitors or market or clients? Or I haven't been able to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
And so from your perspective, are you seeing biotech companies becoming more open to flexible operating models?
Yes, I've heard that. Again, just sort of feeding into what you've mentioned, one of the standard things that a lot of people say is that when, asked, or do you have any questions for me, sort of thing, it's like, what does success look like in this role?
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you've just pinpointed, Brad. It's like, what are the first things that need to be accomplished or done or fixed that this these people are actually hiring for? To me, it's a little bit bizarre because having been in big pharma, I don't really buy the fact that these guys are sitting around a committee table saying, okay, we've got the budget for a hire, but we don't actually know what we're hiring for. I think they will have discussed what they need, when they need it, how they need it, and what it's for before they start laying out a job rec. To me, there's a huge gap there, and I don't understand what's going on, and I don't understand why it is. They can't just be totally upfront. And in certain cases, again, with bigger organizations, the position's already earmarked for someone internally, and they're doing it because by legal requirement, they need to put it out there, potentially.
Yeah.
Um, and that is really bad. I think that's terrible because so many people are sort of hoodwinked into applying for these things when there's never ever going to be a chance that they're even looked at, and the AI algorithm is going to spit them out immediately. So there has to be a huge fix, if you like, in what's going on, in my opinion.
It's interesting. It's something that Brad and I talk to our clients about all the time. I think we actually did a search kickoff podcast on that, really helping the hiring managers outline how to ask the right questions before they're putting the job description together. Right.
Yeah.
Or even how to talk about maybe like a fractional, talent acquisition, how it would fit into it, fractional operational support. What is it that you need? Have an honest conversation, describe your pain points, and we can help you design what it needs to be. And what's interesting is that our listeners, besides Brad's and my mom who listen to our podcast, but our listeners are not just the hiring managers who we would be happy to help, but we also have candidates, right, who are currently on the job market who fit, like, maybe they don't fit neatly into either a single box, or cannot check off every single one of those unicorn
Yes.
job description points. So from somebody with your level of experience, any advice in today's admittedly really crazy and pretty frustrating market for the job seekers too?
Again, it's wrapped into some of the commentaries that we've made over the course of the last few minutes. It's really understanding, is this a real posting or is it just a sort of
Mm,
because we have to do it legally? Is it is it really defined as to what that function is? And then the candidates, I think, need to tailor their application with a strong cover letter that pulls on what they consider the most relevant and important aspects of that posting. If
Mm.
again, one can assume that the posting is valid. Um, the problem is that the candidates unfortunately never know if anybody human is looking at this,
Yeah.
or if it is just the beginnings of a very silly computer generated process that maybe, things are going to work out. And you hear it all the time. People should be connected into a network and they should be talking in the network to the relevant people. Yeah, of course they should, but that in itself is very, very tough to do as well, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
can't just go bumping up to somebody in the hiring suite of a big pharma and start chat. Let me buy you a
That's
beer and
right.
let's talk about a job. It just doesn't happen. So I think it's a very, very tough scenario, and there's no one
To be
answer.
fair, that'd be a lot of beers.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So I think that there really is a need for a lot of these organizations to be sort of honest and transparent about what is going on. I mean, and of course it's never happened, right? I mean, when we used to apply for jobs, 30, 40 years ago, you did it by letter, or you looked at an ad in a magazine, trade magazine, and you applied with your CV, and you had no idea if it was
That you
real or
mailed in an envelope.
and you had
Yes.
no idea if it was real until and unless you got a letter back or an email back or a
Yeah.
telephone call back. And unfortunately, it's just compounded by the fact that there's a lot more of it, and there's a lot more sort of AI generated rubbish that you have to sift through.
Sure,
Yes.
sure. Well, Kevin, this has been a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything we didn't ask you that you wish we had, or anything you'd like to leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
Look, I truly appreciate, obviously, our prior conversations and the opportunity to speak with you today, especially on this relatively public forum. I mean, I hope that I have been able to sort of convey things as my opinion and nothing more than my
Feel
opinion and
smarter. Mhm.
experiences. But really, I think there are so many of us who are swirling around in the very same sort of arena of certain things that we know need to be done, can be done, and will be done, with a whole pile of stuff that we have no idea what's going on, no transparency, and God knows if it will ever change or get better. And it's really, the very important fact is to be able to have conversations live. And I think that's really where a lot of people benefit, more so than obviously just sort of sitting on a computer all day long, looking at different platforms and different algorithms as to what's going on. So I very much appreciate it, and thank you so much. I don't actually have any things that you should have asked me about. I mean, I've got
Okay.
a list of Kevin Bacon movies that you seem to get a few more than I remembered, but really, really, appreciate that, Brad and
Well, no,
Marina.
we had to dig. We had to dig for a couple of them, but
Yeah.
yeah, it
You
was.
didn't sort of outline the fact that the AI is going to cause tremors of change in the industry, and
Oh, nice. Okay. Now Kevin's getting in on the game.
Oh,
All
so
missed
right. Very
opportunity right
nice.
there. Missed
Or at
it's
least
almost
we're
opportunity.
not
yeah,
wading into the mystic river of it, right? um,
exactly.
no, I think this is a good place to end. I love the fact that we started and are ending on the same, which is people matter, right? But robots are still not going to take over the world quite yet. We can be assured of that. Um, we do just, I think it's worth mentioning because we've touched on some of those subjects. We do have a few other episodes that speak specifically about either tweaking your resume to the job that you're applying to, and then also some interview guides for the hiring managers, maybe to help them prep a little bit better. So you can check those out. That's for our listeners. But I don't know if you counted all of Kevin Bacon's references. So we've managed to work in what? Footloose, A Few Good Men,
Yeah,
Tremors twice,
seven of
uh,
them. So
Apollo 13, Hollow Man. Animal House. I think I mentioned Mystic River, but that, and then the unnecessary reference of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. That's totally Brad's.
That's all
And
right.
I guess that is showing remarkable restraint because we could have probably done a lot more.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
Kevin, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to leave the final word to Brad.
My pleasure. Thank
Well,
you.
and, as always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Talent Lab.